Secretary of State and other executive branch officers to the legislature. One Arizona bill flatly states that the legislature may revoke the Secretary of State's issuance or certification of a presidential elector's certificate of election by a simple majority vote. Some state legislatures seek to impose criminal penalties on local election officials alleged to have committed technical infractions, including things like obstructing the view of poll watchers. The stage is thus being set for chaos. Imagine weeks of competing mass protests across multiple states as lawmakers from both parties claim victory and charge the other with unconstitutional efforts to take power. Partisans on both sides are likely to be better armed and more willing to inflict harm than they were in 2020. Would governors call out the National Guard? Would President Biden nationalize the Guard and place it under his control, invoke the Insurrection Act, send troops into Pennsylvania or Texas or Wisconsin to quell violent protests? Deploying federal power in the states would be decried as tyranny. Biden would find himself where other presidents have been, where Andrew Jackson was during the nullification crisis, or where Abraham Lincoln was after the South seceded, navigating without rules or precedents, making his own judgments about what constitutional powers he does and doesn't have. Today's arguments over the filibuster will seem quaint in 3 years if the American political system enters a crisis for which the Constitution offers no remedy. Most Americans, and all but a handful of politicians, have refused to take this possibility seriously enough to try to prevent it. As has so often been the case in other countries where fascist leaders arise, their would-be opponents are paralyzed in confusion and amazement at this charismatic authoritarian. They've followed the standard model of appeasement, which always begins with underestimation. The political and intellectual establishments in both parties have been underestimating Trump since he emerged on the scene in 2015. They underestimated the extent of his popularity and the strength of his hold on his followers. They underestimated his ability to take control of the Republican Party, and then they underestimated how far he was willing to go to retain power. The fact that he failed to overturn the 2020 election has reassured many that the American system remains secure, though it could easily have gone the other way if Biden had not been safely ahead in all 4 states where the vote was close, if Trump had been more competent and more in control of the decision makers in his administration and in Congress and in the states. As it was, Trump came close to bringing off a coup earlier this year. All that prevented it was a handful of state officials with notable courage and integrity, and the reluctance of 2 attorneys general and a vice president to obey orders they deemed inappropriate. These were not the checks and balances the framers had in mind when they designed the Constitution, of course. But Trump has exposed the inadequacy of those protections. Again, that's from Robert Kagan, who is a very conservative thinker, somebody with whom I agree on basically nothing, but who has put a point on this moment. He published this in the Washington Post last night on the eve of these Arizona election results being released. And the Arizona election results released today were hilarious. They found by their own methodology that Biden won by even more in Arizona than we previously knew. But then they spent hours today laying out why they thought the election still seemed suspect to them. The result from former President Trump was to call, on the basis of this audit, for the Arizona election results to be decertified, for himself to be proclaimed the winner in Arizona, even after this audit that just proclaimed that he lost even worse than we knew he did before. We are at a moment that is hilarious and infuriating, but it's corrosive in a way that we need to talk about too. And we're going to speak tonight, this hour, live with the Arizona Secretary of State, with the actual state official in Arizona in charge of administering elections in that state. Her reaction today to what happened